The year was 1847, and behind the lace curtains and polished mahogany of London's finest drawing rooms, a horror story was unfolding that would make your worst relationship nightmares seem like fairy tales. While poets penned verses about romantic love and novelists crafted tales of courtship, the reality of Victorian marriage was a suffocating cage of legal brutality, sexual ignorance, and psychological torment that destroyed countless lives in the name of respectability. Today, we're stripping away the rose-tinted glasses of period dramas and diving into the shocking truth about what marriage actually meant for millions of people trapped in an era where love was luxury few could afford. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view this so-called golden age of family values. The carefully constructed myth of Victorian domestic bliss was built on a foundation of secrets so dark that even whispers of them could destroy reputations forever. By the time we're done, you'll understand why suicide rates among married women reached epidemic proportions, why perfectly sane individuals were locked away in asylums for daring to seek happiness, and how an institution supposedly blessed by God became a living hell for those unfortunate enough to be born in the wrong century. This isn't just history. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when society prioritizes control over compassion and tradition over human dignity. The world we're about to enter is one where a woman's wedding day marked not the beginning of her happiest chapter, but quite literally, the legal death of her very existence as an individual human being. Under the doctrine of coverture, which governed British law throughout the Victorian era, marriage transformed two separate people into one legal entity, and that entity was always, without exception, the husband. The moment a woman spoke those seemingly innocent words, "I do," she ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. Her property became his property. Her money became his money. Her body became his property to use as he saw fit. Even her children, should she be fortunate enough to survive childbirth, belonged entirely to him. She could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued, could not own anything, could not even will away her possessions, because legally speaking, she had no possessions to will away. This wasn't some obscure legal technicality that rarely affected daily life. This was the brutal reality that governed every aspect of a married woman's existence. If her husband decided to sell her jewelry to pay his gambling debts, she had no recourse. If he chose to beat her senseless every night, the law considered it his right to discipline his property. If he wanted to lock her in the house for months on end, denying her contact with family and friends, society applauded his dedication to protecting her virtue. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, designed to extract maximum compliance from women who might otherwise resist their fate. Young girls, often barely out of childhood, were coached extensively on the sacred nature of their upcoming sacrifice. They were told that their highest calling was to serve, that their greatest achievement would be the complete erasure of their own desires in favor of their husband's will. Church sermons leading up to weddings hammered home the message with relentless brutality. Wives were instructed to submit to their husbands in all things, to never question their judgment, to find joy in their own diminishment. The marriage vows themselves were carefully crafted to ensure women understood their new status. While men promised to love and cherish, women were required to promise obedience, a word that carried the full weight of legal and social enforcement. But the true horror began not in the church, but in the bedroom, where Victorian sexual ignorance created a nightmare that would haunt couples for decades. The era's obsession with purity and moral rectitude had produced a generation of people so catastrophically unprepared for physical intimacy that their wedding nights often resembled medical procedures more than romantic encounters. Young women entered marriage with virtually no understanding of what physical intimacy entailed. Their mothers, bound by social convention and their own traumatic experiences, typically offered nothing more than cryptic warnings about wifely duties that must be endured with Christian resignation. Medical literature of the time, written exclusively by men, portrayed female sexuality as either non-existent or pathological, creating a cultural understanding that women who experienced any form of physical pleasure were fundamentally diseased. The wedding night, therefore, became an exercise in brutality disguised as sacred ritual. Terrified brides, often genuinely believing they were about to be murdered, were expected to submit silently to experiences they couldn't understand or contextualize. Their husbands, equally ignorant but socially permitted to be aggressive, often approached the situation with the sensitivity of livestock farmers attending to breeding schedules. Victorian medical journals are filled with accounts of wedding nights that ended with the bride requiring medical attention. Not from gentle nervousness, but from genuine physical trauma inflicted by husbands who had no understanding of anatomy, consent, or basic human kindness. These same medical journals then blamed the women for their injuries, suggesting that proper wives would have anticipated their husbands' needs better and prepared accordingly. The psychological damage from these early experiences rippled through entire marriages, creating cycles of fear, resentment, and mutual incomprehension that poisoned every aspect of domestic life. Women learned to associate physical intimacy with pain and violation, while men grew frustrated with partners who seemed perpetually unwilling and unresponsive. Neither party had the language, knowledge, or social permission to address these fundamental problems. What made this situation even more tragic was the complete absence of any support system for struggling couples. Divorce was virtually impossible, requiring acts of parliament and astronomical legal fees that put it beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest families. Even legal separation demanded proof of extreme cruelty that would satisfy Victorian judges. Men who believed that occasional beatings and emotional abuse fell well within the normal range of marital relations. Women who dared to complain about their treatment faced immediate social ostracism and accusations of failing in their fundamental duty as wives. The doctrine of separate spheres, which supposedly elevated women by placing them in charge of domestic virtue, actually trapped them in a prison of impossible expectations. They were held responsible for their husband's moral behavior, their children's development, and the spiritual atmosphere of the home, while being denied any actual authority to influence these outcomes. The economic realities of Victorian marriage created additional layers of entrapment that make modern financial difficulties seem trivial by comparison. Middle-class families lived in a delicate balance where maintaining appearances often required spending beyond their means, but the husband's authority over all financial decisions meant wives had no control over the family's economic destiny. Women watched helplessly as their husbands made disastrous business investments, accumulated gambling debts, or simply spent family resources on personal luxuries, while the household lacked basic necessities. The wife might possess superior financial judgment, might understand exactly what needed to be done to salvage the family situation, but her legal non-existence meant her insights were worthless. She could only watch as her children's futures were mortgaged away by a man whose authority was absolute, regardless of his competence. This economic powerlessness extended to every aspect of household management. While Victorian ideology claimed that women ruled the domestic sphere, the reality was that they managed it only at their husband's pleasure, and within budgets he determined. A woman might scrimp and save to create a comfortable home, only to have her husband sell the furniture to pay debts she knew nothing about. She might carefully nurture family relationships, only to have him forbid contact with relatives who had somehow offended him. The children born into these marriages faced their own unique tragedies, caught between parents who were often strangers to each other and sometimes barely functional as human beings. Victorian child-rearing practices, influenced by the same rigid moral framework that destroyed marriages, prioritized obedience and conformity over emotional development or individual expression. Children learned early that their father's word was absolute law, but they also witnessed daily the fear and resentment their mother tried desperately to hide. They grew up understanding that marriage meant the complete subjugation of one person to another. That love was something that happened in novels, but not in real life, and that their own futures would likely replicate the misery they observed at home. The cycle of generational trauma was as predictable as it was heartbreaking. Sons learned that masculinity meant dominance, that expressing tenderness was weakness, and that women existed primarily to serve their needs. They entered their own marriages, carrying forward the same brutal patterns, perpetuating a system that had already claimed their mothers as casualties. Daughters absorbed even more devastating lessons about their own worthlessness, preparing themselves for lives of quiet desperation that would mirror their mother's experiences with terrifying precision. Victorian society had created an elaborate mythology around motherhood that made these family dynamics even more psychologically damaging. Women were told that their maternal instincts would naturally guide them toward perfect child-rearing, but the reality was that most mothers were struggling with their own trauma while trying to raise children in households where genuine affection was actively discouraged. The medical establishment of the era compounded these problems by treating women's emotional distress as evidence of inherent female weakness rather than rational responses to impossible circumstances. Physicians routinely diagnosed women with hysteria, neurasthenia, and other convenient conditions that pathologized their suffering, while absolving society of any responsibility for creating the conditions that caused it. Treatment for these supposed ailments often involved isolation from family, friends, and any stimulating activities that might encourage independent thought. Women who complained about their marriages were prescribed rest cures that amounted to psychological torture, confined to darkened rooms for months at a time with no books, no visitors, no activities whatsoever. The message was clear. Questioning your circumstances was evidence of mental illness that required aggressive medical intervention. Private asylums flourished during this period, filled not with genuinely disturbed individuals, but with women whose primary crime was refusing to accept their degraded status. Husbands could commit their wives with shocking ease, often requiring nothing more than testimony that the woman had become difficult to manage or had expressed inappropriate opinions about her treatment. These institutions became warehouses for women who had dared to resist, who had sought education, who had attempted to leave abusive marriages, or who had simply grown tired of pretending that their lives were tolerable. Once committed, women faced treatments designed to break their spirits completely. Cold water baths, mechanical restraints, forced feeding, and isolation were considered standard therapeutic approaches for female patients who refused to embrace their supposed natural role. The religious establishment played a crucial role in maintaining this system of institutionalized abuse by providing moral justification for practices that any reasonable person would recognize as torture. Sermons regularly emphasized that wives who failed to find joy in their suffering were defying God's will and endangering their immortal souls. The church taught that earthly happiness was not only unnecessary, but actually spiritually dangerous for women who were naturally inclined toward sin and needed constant masculine guidance to remain virtuous. This religious framework meant that women couldn't even seek solace in prayer without being reminded of their fundamental inadequacy. They were taught that their dissatisfaction with marriage was evidence of sinful pride, that their longing for companionship revealed dangerous selfishness, and that their physical suffering was divine punishment for Eve's original transgression. Every aspect of their pain was reframed as moral failing rather than injustice. The rare women who managed to escape these marriages faced social consequences so severe that many chose to remain in abusive situations rather than risk complete ostracism. A separated or divorced woman became a social pariah, excluded from respectable society, and often unable to find employment or housing. Her own family frequently disowned her, rather than face the shame of association with a woman who had failed in her primary duty. These social outcasts often ended up in workhouses, forced into prostitution, or dead by suicide, their fates serving as warnings to other women who might consider rebellion. The Victorian era created elaborate support systems for maintaining marriages. but absolutely none for helping people escape them, ensuring that even the most desperate situations continued indefinitely. The economic structure of Victorian society made women's dependence on marriage not just socially expected, but practically unavoidable. Educational opportunities for women were severely limited. Professional careers were almost entirely closed to them, and even basic financial literacy was considered inappropriate for ladies to possess. A woman who never married faced poverty and social marginalization, while a woman who left her marriage faced the same fate with the added burden of moral condemnation. This system created a perfect trap where women had no choice but to marry, no preparation for marriage, no power within marriage, and no escape from marriage. The result was a generation of people living in legalized slavery, their every moment governed by laws and customs designed to ensure their complete subjugation to men who were themselves often struggling with impossible expectations and their own forms of psychological damage. The violence that permeated Victorian marriages extended far beyond physical brutality into psychological warfare that left no aspect of a woman's inner life untouched. Husbands learned to use isolation, humiliation, and economic control as weapons, just as effective as fists, often more so because they left no visible marks that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors or relatives. The constant threat of being declared insane and committed to an asylum hung over every married woman like a sword of Damocles, making resistance not just difficult, but genuinely dangerous. Women learned to hide their thoughts, suppress their emotions, and perform contentment so convincingly that even their own children never suspected the depth of their despair. As we step back from this chamber of horrors, disguised as domestic bliss, the carefully constructed facade of Victorian virtue crumbles before our eyes like the brittle pages of a forgotten diary. What we've witnessed isn't just historical curiosity, but a stark reminder of how quickly civilization can transform love into torture, partnership into slavery, and sacred vows into instruments of destruction. The next time you encounter those sepia-toned photographs of stern-faced couples or read romantic descriptions of bygone eras, remember the untold millions who suffered in silence behind those closed doors. Their stories demand to be heard, their pain acknowledged, and their sacrifice remembered as we continue to fight for the freedoms they could never imagine. Victorian marriage wasn't just worse than we thought. It was a systematic machinery of human destruction that consumed entire generations in service of maintaining power structures that benefited no one except those who profited from others' misery. The ghosts of those silenced voices still echo through history,